Hey everybody, welcome back to the program. Today we're talking about terrible debut albums. I'm talking albums that nearly destroyed the careers of highly successful bands and artists that we know today. And I find that so interesting because all it took was just a little nudge, a little push, a little belief by one or more people to really bring these artists back into the recording studio to give it one more chance to really shine. And in some cases, it took a couple more albums to finally get to where we know them today. But it's crazy how just that little shift might not have happened and they would have gone a completely different direction. And that's what we're going to be talking about today. These are 10 of the worst debut albums by bands or artists that eventually went on to have incredibly successful careers. Now, before we get into the albums, I want to make it clear that I'm not saying that any of these albums are bad or terrible, but simply that they were disastrous in terms of commercial performance when they were first released. In fact, some of them have gone on to be highly successful as the bands or artists grew in popularity, but in other cases, those involved would rather forget the albums ever existed. In either case, these records show that second chances, hard work, luck, and belief can overcome a terrible debut. First up, we have Warren Zevon's 1970 album Wanted Dead or Alive. And it's really not a bad record, but I don't think it showcases his talents as well as his later work does. Upon release, it sold poorly and was largely ignored by critics. By the summer of 1975, Warren left the music business and moved to Spain, but by September, he was back in LA living with Lindsey Buckingham and Stevie Nicks. It was at this time that he and Jackson Browne started collaborating, which led to his 1976 self-titled second album. While the album wasn't a major success, it did chart in the US and paved the way for his 1978 breakthrough album, Excitable Boy. At number 9, we have Chestnut Street Incident by John Mellencamp, when he was known as Johnny Cougar. Now, this is a tough record to listen to, and it's no wonder why it's not on his Spotify page. The album only sold around 12,000 copies upon its release, causing his record label MCA to cancel plans to release his follow-up, and they eventually let him go from his contract. About a year later, he signed with Rod Stewart's manager and recorded his third album, A Biography, which scored a top 5 hit in Australia with the single I Need a Lover. The single was added to his fourth album, and the record became a big hit thanks to the single. John would go on to have massive success throughout the 80s and became a household name, but if it wasn't for his determination, it's easy to imagine him giving up before his career ever took off. Moving on to number 8, we have It by Pulp from 1983. Largely composed of pastoral, folky type songs, the album failed to gain any commercial or critical success, and soon after its release, every band member left the group except for the lead singer, Jarvis Cocker. At the suggestion of his record label, Jarvis recorded 2 singles in a more commercial style similar to Wham! I'm not making this up. These also failed to be a hit, and Jarvis was about to end the band for good when a chance rehearsal with new musicians led to a new, edgier sound for Pulp. Of course, it would take a few more years for the band to hit mainstream success with their fourth album, His and Hers, in 1994. At number 7, we have Rock-A-Rolla by Judas Priest from 1974. Again, not really a bad album, but more of a problem with production and timing. However, this was the least of their problems as the album tanked, selling only 1,000 copies, which left the band with massive debt. They were forced to sleep in their touring van, eat 1 meal a day, and work any part-time jobs they could find. By the winter of 1975, they were back in the studio recording their second album, Sad Wings of Destiny. While this album was also commercially unsuccessful, it did catch the attention of CBS Records, who offered the band £60,000 to produce their next album, which was a huge win, as their first 2 albums were made for just £2,000 each. Their third album, Sin After Sin, was their first album to chart in the UK and brought them out of debt, leading the way to their massive success in the early 1980s. At number 6, we have From Genesis to Revelation by Genesis. And when it was released in March of 1969, it sold very poorly, as many record stores thought it was a gospel album and filed it with the other religious records. In fact, keyboardist Tony Banks claims that the album only sold around 600 copies a year after its release. A couple of months after the album came out, the band got together to decide if they really wanted to keep going as a group. And they might have seriously ended it right there and then, since many of them had offers to continue on in their college studies. In the end, though, they decided to stay together, but even then, it was a long road to the eventual success that they are known for today. Coming Coming in at number 5, we have Juvenile Hell by Mobb Deep. Even though Juvenile Hell produced 2 underground singles, the album failed to gain any critical or commercial success, and their label dropped them soon after its release. In the summer of 1993, they were picked up by a new record label, and in the spring of 1994, Nas released his debut album, which had a profound effect on Mobb Deep. Prodigy later recalls that they took a hard look at their sound and realized they didn't tell their story correctly on their debut. They entered the studio to record their follow-up with the intention of digging deep to share who they are, their fears, and their story. They also knew that this was their last chance. If this album failed to chart, they weren't going to get a second. When The Infamous was released in April of 1995, it was a massive success, debuting at the number 15 spot on the Billboard Top 200 and was certified gold by the summer. This cemented them as among the greatest hip-hop duos to ever record. At number 4, we have Lou Reed with his self-titled debut. After his departure from the Velvet Underground in 1970, there were a lot of expectations placed on Lou Reed and what his solo debut might sound like. After taking a year off and working as a typist at his father's tax accounting office, Lou Reed signed with MCA Records and flew to London to record his debut with session musicians and a couple of members from the band Yes. And while the album mostly consisted of songs he wrote during his time with the Velvet Underground, when the album was released in May of '72, it was seen as a disappointment to fans and critics alike. It's very possible that if David Bowie and Mick Ronson hadn't stepped in to produce his follow-up album, Lou Reed might have gone back to being a typist. When Transformer was released later the same year, its mainstream commercial success established Lou Reed's solo career, elevating him from an underground artist to an internationally recognized singer. At number 3, we have Billy Joel's Cold Spring Harbor. While not a bad album by any stretch of the imagination, Billy Joel's debut suffered from a mastering problem that accidentally cut his record 7% faster than what was recorded. The result was that everything, including his voice, was raised in pitch, causing him to sound more like a Bee Gee than himself. Because of this error, the record failed to chart and was seen as a commercial disappointment. Needless to say, Billy was frustrated and disappointed. Now, this might have stopped someone with less ambition than him, but he went on to tour in support of the album regardless, opening up for such acts as the Beach Boys and Badfinger. About a year after the album's release, he moved to Los Angeles after signing a new record deal with Columbia and ended up releasing Piano Man in November of 1973, launching his career into the mainstream, and obviously the rest is history. The number 2 spot is filled by David Bowie, and again, while not a bad record, and one that clearly shows his talent as a songwriter and singer, it didn't exactly catch the attention of the record-buying public. Bowie recorded several follow-up singles in a different style, but all were rejected by his label, and eventually he left them in May of 1968. At this point, Bowie shifted his attention to the dramatic arts and became interested in creating personas. He also started to perform as a mime, even touring with T-Rex with a mime act. Around the same time, his manager Kenneth Pitt thought a promotional film would be the best way to showcase his talents. The film featured a mime piece performed by Bowie, as well as a couple of songs from his debut, but more importantly, the film featured a new song called Space Oddity. The song would go on to be his first hit single, and while the film wasn't released until 1984, Space Oddity became a pivotal direction for his follow-up album from 1969. It would still take a number of years and several albums later until he became a mainstream success, but it's pretty amazing to think that if he had found more success as a mime, he might have stayed in the theater arts. At the number 1 spot, we have Bob Dylan. The album was released in March of 1962 to little success. It supposedly only sold around 5,000 copies, barely enough to break even. And there were those within Columbia Records that were pushing to drop him from the label, calling him Hammond's Folly, since it was producer John Hammond who signed him in the first place. But John defended Dylan and was determined to make his next album a success. John was ultimately proven right, and millions of albums later, Dylan is a household name. And it's hard to say if Dylan wouldn't have been a success on another label, but without the support of John, it might have taken much longer for Dylan to find that, and who knows, he might have never even found it in the first place. He might have just stayed an underground artist, or maybe he would have quit music altogether and become a poet. We'll never really know, but the free will in Bob Dylan is really what put Dylan on the map. Alright everybody, that will do it for today. If you know of another nearly career-killing debut album, be sure to let me know with a comment down below. Until then, I want to thank you all so much for watching, but I especially want to thank my members over on Patreon. They really help to keep this show going. If you're interested in learning how you can help as well, there's a link down below. Until then, I am your Vinyl Geek, and I'll catch you on the flip side.